Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the second day of our Global Business Forum. Global Business Forum, which is focusing on excuse me, investment opportunities across the CIS Eurasia region, and has its theme, as you see, ancient roots, new opportunities, so new Silk Road, as it were. Yesterday we had a very dynamic session, a lot of interesting discussion. Inevitably, there was a great focus on this whole theme of Silk Road, which an integration across the region, which we will be focusing on today in several sections and fleshing it out, specifically looking at where are the opportunities for investors, what areas, what countries, what sectors you should be looking at in the next few years to make money. Yesterday also we had a lot of discussion, of course, about the impact of low energy prices, low oil price. Of course, countries like Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and of course Russia in particular are all being badly affected by the decline in the oil price. So there was a great deal of focus on what that might mean. And I would say in general, while of course we can all depress ourselves in this part of the world when we're looking at low oil price, I would say in general there was more optimism that almost because of the low oil price rather than in despite of it, that this is the time when countries will have no choice but to push ahead with diversification, will push ahead with efforts to create new sources of growth in the future. And we can certainly see that in Russia right now, which of course is being hit by the combination not just of low oil price, but also the continuing sanctions. And of course that is, despite what we're hearing from government sources, it is having a serious impact, and this really is crunch year for Russia. The encouraging point, I would say, about the Russia story in particular is that government officials are no longer talking theoretically about reforms or no longer talking theoretically about different investment programs. They're now starting to focus much more practically on what can be done in terms of industrial policy, what can be done to attract investors into particular areas. And that's something that I would expect to see across the region in Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, also as this kind of period of low oil continues. And we had yesterday some people who are from sort of countries in CIS not impacted by oil or sort of not oil dependent, so Georgia, Armenia, and their stories were quite encouraging in that those governments have developed programs, created more diversification, invested in programs that are now leading to growth in areas such as technology, biotech, logistics. So a good example for other countries, particularly in this context of ancient roots, new opportunities. So more encouraging, I would say, rather than depressing. We had a session yesterday looking at the future energy that actually evolved into not so much future energy, in other words, alternative energy sources, but more just about the future. And again, I would say the net conclusion was more net optimistic from that session rather than negative. The panelists talked about how countries that have developed a dependency on hydrocarbons, oil and gas, can leverage off that, can leverage off their skill sets, whether it's in engineering or chemicals or technology, to build new sources of growth, to build new exports, to build new employment opportunities. All of the panelists did highlight, of course, a couple of very key factors that need to happen, such as more investment in education. And this is something that we've seen in Georgia and Armenia, those countries that have been more successful in creating more diversification. They have spent money over the last 10 years in education. And there's been a cultural change, which also needs to happen in Central Asia. I think, quite frankly, we can all understand that in a period when oil revenues in particular are rising steadily year after year, there's a certain amount of laziness in terms of you can talk a lot about reforms, you can talk a lot about what needs to be done, but in reality there's no pressure. And that's what we've seen in countries like Kazakhstan, Russia, Azerbaijan. And from the message and discussion yesterday, the hope is that that now is changing, and therefore the opportunities for investors, in particular in those new areas, will start to arise in easier. But there was also an understanding that this is not going to happen quickly, that many countries in CIS, they still culturally have are linked, as it were, almost to the old Soviet days. When you look at the political leadership across the region, most of the current leaders are still those who transited from the Soviet Union, and the, if you like, the political elite, the people who run the countries, the bureaucrats, are also people who have been there for more than a couple of decades. So there is an understanding, and there was an understanding from yesterday's discussion, that this is something that also needs to change. There needs to be an evolution in terms of a generational shift to new management, new ideas, new culture. But again, that's something that we can now see starting to happen across the region slowly. And I think over the next 5 to 10 years, there is going to be a considerable shift, considerable change in the way countries are run. And if we assume a low oil price environment for several years, then that can only make that change quicker and I think more effective, and particularly more interesting for investors. Yesterday, in terms of feedback, we found that there was a great deal of interest into technology sectors across the region. It seems that a lot of people, a lot of investors are looking at technology, can see what's been happening in Armenia and Georgia and elsewhere. Even in Russia, there's been some very positive and successful developments. Companies like Yandex now dominate the region, excuse me, more so than Google. And again, so investors are looking at those new opportunities as kind of service consumer markets develop. And of course, also a lot of questions about transport and logistics associated with Silk Road. So today, that was yesterday, and I say generally more net optimism that the region is at a point of change. And we're going to explore that or delve down further into that today. Our first session coming up next is looking specifically at the impact of the Silk Road. We'll delve down much more into this theme. What does it actually mean in terms of this maritime Silk Road? How is it going to integrate the economies? What opportunities is it going to create for investors? And particularly, of course, the integration with GCC states, the integration with Gulf states such as the UAE. Where will be the opportunities? We hope to hear that from the panel. Following that, we have a session on diversification, overcoming challenges, reaping rewards. And again, this is something that came up yesterday. Quite a number of people in the audience, in terms of their comments, were highlighting the fact that countries in the region can, if you like, address the low-hanging fruit. Issues such as just making it easier to get a visa, to set up bank accounts, to do basic kind of entry work. These are areas that a lot of people found frustrating when they were looking at Central Asia, and expressed the hope that they would be addressed by those countries soon. And this is something that will come up in that diversification session. After that, we have a session on Islamic finance. And again, that topic, I guess, just opens up the whole question of funding for opportunities in Central Asia. Where will you get the money? How will you raise the money? What does it make? How does it make sense, if you like, in terms of funding to invest in Central Asia? Matching risk reward, matching opportunity. So that will be explored in that session at 11:30. And then in the afternoon, and I know it's Thursday afternoon, but really would encourage everybody, as many people as possible, to stay for the afternoon session, because we have people who have practical examples, or practical experience, of working in the region, of investing in the region. The first session in the afternoon will have the Chief Executive of Visa and General Manager for IBM covering the region, both companies that have a lot of experience in dealing across all of the countries in CIS, have been very successful in developing their businesses, and hopefully will tell us about their experience, what's been good, what's been bad, and provide some pointers for investors as to what you should be wary of and generally how to go about it. And then finally, the last session, also very interesting. Stuart Pan is the logistics officer for HP. HP is recognized as being one of the pioneers of investing in the region, in cross Central Asia, has been very successful. And Stuart will talk to us about the whole question of establishing supply chain logistic routes across the region, the do's and don'ts, and the benefit of his experience. So I think today's session is going to be a lot more, today's program is going to be a lot more about listening to those with experience of having done it. And hopefully that then will be very useful for the audience who are also looking at these opportunities. So without further ado, thank you very much indeed for attending today's session, and thank you for attention. And I'm now going to pass on to the next panel. Thank you.
Chris, thank you very much indeed. And good morning, everybody. We're going to be looking in this session about the impact